From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Good Sunday morning. New poll data shows what Texans think lawmakers should focus on this legislative session. Republicans seem to be on the same page, but that's not the case for Democrats. We'll have more on that in just a minute, but first, let's get to the 3 things you need to know in Texas politics. Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro shared he had surgery Monday to remove cancerous tumors from his small intestines. The San Antonio Democrat shared his prognosis is good and he expects to be back to work in Washington in a few weeks.
I remember hearing my best friend's screams.
A survivor of the Robb Elementary School shooting was one of the speakers at a gun safety rally at the Capitol on Tuesday. Survivors of gun violence and gun safety advocacy groups called on Texas lawmakers to pass what they call common sense legislation, such as expanded background checks, and also to raise the age to purchase guns. Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, Beaumont Republican Dade Phelan, has been slowly revealing his top legislative priorities. On Thursday, he dropped a big one, House Bill 2, the Property Tax Relief Act, saying it would deliver the largest property tax cut in Texas history. The bill would lower school district property taxes by 28% and reduce the limit on annual appraisal increases from 10% to 5%, not just on houses, but on all property in Texas, a move that would have a substantial impact on businesses as well as homeowners. The speaker estimates it would save homeowners an average of $460 on their property tax bills in 2024 and $590 in 2025. But it may not be an easy sell in the upper chamber. Speaking at the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Policy Summit, the same summit that Phelan touted the idea, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick seemingly dismissed it, saying reducing appraisal increases won't have the intended impact the House is hoping for. Instead, Patrick wants to pass Senate Bill 3, increasing the homestead tax exemption to $70,000 a year. This week, the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin released a new poll detailing what Texans think state lawmakers should focus on this session. Dr. James Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project, joined me to talk about the results. Let's talk a little bit about the legislature, because one of the things you asked is what should the ledge be focused on? Talk to us about the data. What are Texans saying?
Yeah, we approach this as we often do at this phase of the session. It's very early. And I think we know that not that many Texans are paying extremely close attention. We actually asked them fewer than 10% say they're paying extremely close attention. So we started off fairly early in the survey by asking people what we call an open-ended question. We don't give them any choices. We just say, here's a box. Tell us in a few words what you think the legislature's top priority is going to be. And lo and behold, you'll be shocked. Border security and immigration was the top response. About 24% said immigration and border security. And then we saw, less than 10% scattered among a range of other kinds of responses. If you combine people that said inflation and the cost of living and the economy, combined, that is about 14%. And that was the next most common answer. And then, of course, as you would expect, with very different responses between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans much more likely to say immigration and border security. In fact, about half of Republicans said that. A familiar result based on our previous probing of what Texans think is the most important problem, with Democrats much more likely to say gun control and gun safety. That was their top response, but it was still the response of I think only about a quarter of Democrats. So Democrats, as always, much more spread out among multiple issues. Republicans focused on immigration and border security and the economy.
After the deadliest school shooting in Texas history and teachers rapidly leaving the profession, where does education fall on the list of priorities? This is the first time that the legislature has met in a session since the shooting at Robb Elementary School. And you mentioned guns being a priority for Democrats. Where does school safety fall into the conversation among Texans and what they want lawmakers to do this session?
Well, where we saw school safety, really come up was in a couple of different settings. I mean, more broadly, as I mentioned, we saw it as the most common priority among Democrats in the guise of a response to gun violence and gun safety. Where it also appeared in a very interesting way, it was in a battery of questions in which we gave Texans a whole set of issues that are out there in this very robust discussion on public education that's been going on in the state and that's happening in the legislature. Said, tell us how important each of these are, and then tell us what you think ought to be the top priority. Now, the top priority among Texans was school safety. So 29% said that that should be the number one priority in the education realm. And if you break that down, that was a third of Republicans and about a third of Democrats and about a quarter of Republicans. So it's a point of agreement, I think, among both Democrats and Republicans, though it's not so large that I would call it a groundswell or a consensus. Because once you get beyond school safety in the education realm, Democrats and Republicans have very different priorities.
Right. But tell us, what were the second and third, categories?
Sure. So, for all Texans, when we look at the overall population in the poll, school safety was first, teacher pay or teacher retention was second, and the third was what we labeled curriculum content, that is, what students are taught. Now, that's an interesting encapsulation of some of the issues that we've seen in the public spotlight. And when you break that down by party, you really see, you get a fuller sense of what's going on in the education debate. So for Democrats, the top two priorities were clearly school safety and increasing teacher pay. And that accounted for about 3/4 of Republicans, or that accounted for about 2/3 of Democrats. Republicans, very different. School safety was tied more or less with curriculum content, and that was followed closely in third place by parental rights. And so this discourse of what's being taught in schools, the claims of quote unquote critical race theory being taught in public schools, and the role of parents having more control over things like curriculum and other aspects of education are really front and center in the Republican Party right now.
Interesting stuff. Was there anything that really stood out to you in the polling? I always like to ask you, what were you surprised by?
Well, I mean, I think I would stick with education, and it's not that I'm surprised by it, but it's a really clear portrait, I think, of how Republican candidates and Republican office holders and opinion leaders have found a way to talk about public education that in some ways takes away what has traditionally been Democratic ownership of that issue. So I think we've gone from a discussion that was about, on the Republican side, was always primarily about what was called school choice in terms of vouchers and educational savings accounts. And we're seeing that discussion right now. But they were never really able to reach critical mass in owning the issues in the way that Democrats have traditionally. But now that Republicans are talking about public schools as being a matter not just of educational choice, but of ideological and cultural choice, as they call attention and to the content of education and cause anxiety among Republicans, whether they have kids or in school or not, about the substance of public education and its role in our culture. It's really reframed education in a way that has enabled Republicans, frankly, to reopen this conversation about school choice in different terms.
You can find a link to the full poll results in this story on KVUE.com.